The morning I found her brooch at the bottom of my drawer, the air was thick with rain. The kind that hums softly against the window pane, like a lullaby for unfinished grief. It was an old silver brooch, shaped like a teardrop folded around itself. Time had eaten its shine, leaving behind a soft bruise of rust, gentle, familiar. When I held it, the metal was cold. And suddenly, I was 6 again, sitting at her vanity table, watching her pin it to her cardigan before church. She would always say, "This one remembers things for me." I never asked what it remembered. Maybe I was too young to understand what sorrow could mean when worn on one's chest. That morning the apartment was quiet except for the rain and the hum of the fridge. It should have been an ordinary day. But there it was, the weight of someone else's sadness pulsing through a small piece of metal, asking to be acknowledged. I realized then, we inherit more than faces or names. We inherit pauses, unease, silence at the dinner table. We inherit grief that never learned how to speak. As the rain deepened, I traced the brooch with my thumb and felt something unfamiliar, an ache that didn't belong to me, and yet lived inside me. How do you mourn what you never lost? How do you carry pain that was handed down like heirloom, lace, delicate, torn in places but too sacred to throw away? But no one told me that sometimes healing begins with a question whispered to an empty room. Whose story am I still living? The rhythm of rain slowed. The air shifted. It felt as though the house itself was exhaling something old and beginning again. My grandmother's name was Lydia, but everyone in our village called her Doña Luz, Lady of Light. Not because she was cheerful, but because she could find her way in the dark without a lamp. If a storm broke the electricity lines, she would move through the house by memory, touching walls and furniture as if they were trusted friends. She was not a woman of many words. Her silences carried texture, woolly, firm, protective. When she did speak, her voice came out soft as cloth dipped in water. I always leaned closer, half hoping she'd share her secrets, half afraid of what they might cost. In the afternoon, she sat by the window sewing dresses for women who never looked her in the eyes. Her hands moved fast but graceful, rhythm steady as prayer. Something in her seemed permanently waiting. I never knew what for. My mother told me that after the war, everyone had something they didn't name. Her mother lost 2 brothers, a fiancé, and the piece of herself that believed safety was real. She never cried where anyone could see her. She just stitched longer, tighter, until each seam looked like restraint made visible. As a child, I thought that was strength, to keep moving, keep serving, keep the house smelling of bread even when there was no one left to feed. But years later, when I found the brooch, that image cracked. Because no one told me that quietness can be the loudest warning of all. I remember her humming sometimes, melodies without words. When I tried to join, she'd hush me gently. "Shh, corazon. This song isn't for the living." I laughed then. But now I wonder if grief can hum itself so deeply into your blood that even your descendants know the tune. The village where she lived was surrounded by olive trees. They don't die easily. They bend under drought, under snow, and then they bloom again. Slow, stubborn. Sometimes I think that's why we all learned endurance instead of joy. Resilience was the only language the land understood. When she passed away, the church bells hesitated. The sound came out uneven, like even metal didn't want to say goodbye. At her funeral, my mother, my aunts, the neighbors, all of them stood neatly, eyes dry. The priest's voice echoed, but what filled the room was composure, as if mourning too openly would disrespect all the work it had taken to survive. Afterward, when I tried to explain to friends that my grief felt unfamiliar, as though it had been rehearsed for me long before. I stumbled. They said kindly, "That's just family connection." But there was nothing simple about it. I could feel a history vibrating inside my bones, stories that hadn't had witnesses. Once, digging through boxes in Lydia's attic, I found an old journal. All its pages were blank except for the first line, "I do not write what hurts because paper remembers too well." That sentence stayed with me for years. Maybe that's where her sorrow lived, not in what she said, but in what she refused to write. Sometimes late at night I catch myself imagining what would happen if those unsaid things could finally exhale. Would her spirit lighten? Would mine? Would the silence fall away like dust shaken from an old quilt? But no one told me that memory can skip generations and still land squarely on your chest. That even without her voice I could hear the hum of her unfinished mourning whenever I tried to rest. And so, on the morning I discovered her brooch, I knew some part of my own sadness might not even be mine. It might be hers, lingering, waiting for someone finally willing to name it out loud. After the funeral, life pressed forward with its usual unsuspecting rhythm. Bills arrived. The kettle still whistled. The neighbors still argued about the cat that kept raiding their garbage. But inside our house, something invisible had shifted. My mother moved slower, her hands lingering over every object Lydia once touched. I'd watch her fold the same tablecloth over and over again, as though smoothing wrinkles could erase decades of fatigue. We boxed up my grandmother's belongings, scarves smelling faintly of lavender oil, a chipped teacup, photographs of serious-faced relatives I never met, men in stiff coats, women balancing grief behind polite half-smiles. I wanted to throw nothing away. Every object carried an ache that refused translation. My mother said, "Keep what speaks to you," but almost everything whispered, "How do you decide which memories deserve breath and which must rest?" When Lydia was alive, our relationship felt both tender and distant. She adored me, of that I was sure, but always kept an arm's length of silence between us. Sometimes it felt like she wanted to protect me from her own story. Other times like she didn't believe I'd understand it. In adolescence, I mistook her caution for disapproval. When she said, "Be careful where your heart lands," I heard it as control, not protection. Now, years later, I recognize those words for what they were. A broken transmission of fear disguised as advice, because no one told me that trauma can disguise itself as love, that sometimes our elders show affection only in the language they've survived. I started researching our lineage, the way a child pulls at a thread, curious to see where the unraveling leads. I discovered letters from my great-grandmother, written during wartime evacuation. In them, she mentions a girl with quiet eyes and trembling hands, Lydia as a child, watching the horizon for the father who never returned. That image haunted me. A little girl learning that waiting is safer than wanting. And from that moment, our family seemed to practice endurance like a religion. During those late nights at the kitchen table, reading brittle paper and sipping bitter tea, I began to notice patterns I'd never questioned. Our women spoke softly, worked tirelessly, loved cautiously, apologized even when no one asked them to. Their survival strategy had become our inheritance. The next morning, I looked at my reflection and wondered which parts of me were truly my own. My hesitations? My habit of caretaking until exhaustion? Or the ancestral echo of women who believed self-sacrifice was the price of belonging? Generational healing is a strange terrain. You feel both detective and witness, sorting through evidence written in emotion rather than ink. Some memories aren't yours, but they move through your veins as if they were native. You wake up heavy for no apparent reason and realize you're mourning something that happened 70 years before you were born. One evening I told my mother about this realization. She smiled sadly. "You sound like her," she said. "Always analyzing feelings no one else sees." But her eyes softened with relief too, as if she'd been waiting for someone to notice the unseen cargo. In that moment, I understood. We don't just inherit grief. We inherit the silence built to protect it, and breaking that silence feels both like betrayal and liberation. The ancestral ache hums quietly under every word we choose. When I whisper my grandmother's name now, it doesn't echo the way it used to. It feels lighter, almost ready to forgive itself. But no one told me that learning the story behind your sorrow isn't the end of it. It's only the beginning of your own. There's a peculiar grief in realizing that the person who raised you spoke an entirely different emotional language. Not foreign in culture, foreign in permission. My grandmother's generation didn't speak of feelings. They spoke in chores and gestures and perfectly folded laundry. Sorrow was not confessed. It was organized. Lydia's silence was its own architecture, delicate, elaborate, and meant to survive earthquakes. Inside it she built her world, cooked, prayed, endured. I saw it as devotion. Now I see it as containment. When you grow up around women who never cry, you learn early that tears are private currency. You earn the right to spend them only in solitude. So I followed their example. When my first love ended, I cleaned the kitchen. When my best friend moved away, I rearranged the bookshelf. Action as anesthetic. Order as a way of saying I'm fine. But no one told me that silence could be inherited like a family heirloom. Polished, admired, and never examined for cracks. I often imagine what it must have been like for her after the war. A widow in her early 20s, sewing for others, raising children through scarcity. When she held my mother for the first time, she must have looked at that tiny face and vowed to keep her safe from the same collapse. But protection, when born from trauma, sometimes builds a wall that love has to scale. That wall is what I grew up inside. As a child, I would visit Lydia's house after school. She always greeted me with the same words, "Wash your hands, mi corazón." It sounded like care, and it was, but underneath lingered something else. An anxiety that the world outside carried errors she could not control. Once I caught her standing by the window at dusk, her sewing untouched. Her hands were trembling slightly, fixed on some invisible point beyond the olive trees. When I asked what she was looking at, she said, "Sometimes I watch what no one sees." I never pressed her to explain. I wish I had. Years later, that phrase became the title of the poem I wrote about her, What No One Sees. Poetry became the only translation for our conversations that never happened. Each line an attempt to listen between the spaces of her restraint. Psychologists might call this intergenerational transmission of trauma. Spiritually, I call it echoing, not haunting, just the soul's persistence across time asking to be heard differently. You carry what isn't yours until you understand why it was given to you. When I started therapy in my late 20s, I told my therapist that I didn't know how to feel appropriately. Joy felt suspicious, sadness indulgent. She asked, "Who taught you to ration your emotions?" Without thinking, I said, "My grandmother." The words startled me because they were both accusation and prayer. But no one told me that compassion can look like fury when you first begin to untangle love from expectation. As I learned to name my grief, hers became clearer too. I realized that her silence was not lack of strength. It was evidence of the world she'd survived. Her generation was not invited to process. They were expected to rebuild. And rebuilding leaves no time for softness. Sometimes healing feels like betrayal. When I cry freely now, a small guilt arises, as though I'm wasting the discipline she mastered. But then I imagine her watching me from somewhere unburdened, whispering, "Finally, someone can breathe." Because maybe what each generation truly wants is for the next one to live a little lighter. Maybe all her contained prayers are what made room for mine. I once read that unresolved grief sits in the body like dust in sunlight. It's always there, unnoticed, until light hits it just right. Therapy was that light. It didn't erase the sorrow, but it let me see its texture, its origin, its shape. And in seeing, something softened. I began to speak to my mother, to myself, sometimes even to her portrait. Not to demand answers, but to rewrite the silence she left behind. That's when I understood the quietest secret of all. Her silence was never absence. It was presence, too dense for words, waiting for someone like me to translate it back into sound. But no one told me that breaking the silence would feel like breaking a spell. And yet, once spoken, the air in the room changed, lighter, honest, alive. My mother is nothing like her mother. That's what she insists whenever anyone comments on their similarity of hands or stance. My mother endured. I refuse to, she says, half defensive, half afraid that endurance lives in her bloodstream no matter the protest. She grew up vowing never to repeat Lydia's quietness. But as I grew older, I noticed the repetition anyway. Softer, updated for a new generation, wearing modern clothes. Where Lydia had silence, my mother had busyness. She filled every pause with usefulness. Meals, errands, advice classes, arguments, achievements. Stillness made her nervous. She feared stillness meant remembering. I remember being 12 and watching her rearrange the kitchen cabinets after midnight. The light above the stove washed her face in pale gold, fatigue outlining every motion. Can't sleep? I asked. Too much to do, she said. But there was nothing urgent. The plates were already clean, already orderly. It was the disorder of feeling that terrified her. Yet no one told me that avoiding pain can look remarkably like productivity. She loved me fiercely, like she was trying to outrun the generation before her. When I got sick, she sat by my bed reading recipe books aloud, as if nourishment could heal both our fears. When I cried, she stroked my hair but never asked why. Tears made her uncomfortable. They reminded her of her mother's withheld ones. There's a paradox in our lineage. Each woman builds a life in opposition to the last, yet carries her shadow inside the rebellion. My grandmother chose silence. My mother chose noise. I unknowingly chose analysis, speaking constantly about feelings without ever feeling them. It's astonishing how grief can disguise itself as intellect. When I first moved away from home, our phone calls carried the same rhythm as our family history. Gentle updates, no real admissions. How are you? I'm fine, busy. I'm fine too, busy. A duet of avoidance. The day I told her I'd started therapy, she was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she said, "People like us don't pay strangers to listen." I replied softly, "Maybe that's the point, we've never really been listened to." Her sigh crossed the ocean between us, the sound of generations debating the right to softness. Weeks later, she called again. "I watched a film," she said awkwardly, "about mothers and daughters and memory. I cried. It felt good." That was the first time she admitted to tears. Her voice shook, then steadied. It was as if that single confession cracked a centuries-old dam. Healing, I'm learning, doesn't always descend like light. Sometimes it travels upward through the roots, subtle and unseen, until one branch finally breathes. We began to talk honestly after that. She shared stories about Lydia I'd never heard, how she secretly gave away half her rationed sugar to a neighbor with a newborn, how she walked 5 kilometers to the next town for Mass every Sunday, convinced God could hear her better there, how she once burned an entire letter before finishing it, saying, "Sometimes silence keeps love safer than words." Those stories changed something in me. They added color to the grayscale memory I had painted. They made her human, not myth. And maybe that's where forgiveness begins, not in excusing pain, but in understanding its architecture. But no one told me that empathy can hurt almost as much as anger. Because when you finally see why they did what they did, you also see the loneliness that built it. One afternoon, I found my mother sitting with Lydia's old photograph on her lap. She looked at me and said, I think she was afraid of her own tenderness. It felt like reconciliation spoken aloud, a sentence 70 years in the making. The women in our family didn't learn emotional vocabulary from books or therapy or sermons. They learned it from the quiet endurance of surviving their own hearts. I, however, am learning from them how to unlearn. Because healing doesn't erase inheritance. It sings to it softly until it harmonizes differently. No one told me that loving my mother fully would mean loving her mother too. Even the parts that never healed. Especially those. It happened during the summer heat when the world seemed exhausted from pretending. I'd gone back to my grandmother's village to help my mother sell the old house. The olive trees stood dense and quiet, branches heavy with ripening fruit, bark furrowed like time itself. The house felt smaller than I remembered, filled with ghosts so polite they whispered in creaks. I walked through each room slowly, hand trailing the walls like my grandmother once did. Dust swirled against the light, patient and watchful. It felt like standing inside her unspoken memory. Downstairs, the bathroom tap was leaking, a steady plink, plink, plink. I knelt to tighten it, but the more I turned, the more it wept. It became absurd, almost poetic, the house crying now when none of us could. No one told me that sometimes grief finds its own exit. Later, I filled a basin to wash the old linens. The water, cloudy at first, cleared as if listening. As I submerged the fabric, air bubbled upward, a small gasp from another century. My hands sank deeper, scrubbing rhythmically. It was both mundane and sacred, like baptizing a silence that had lasted too long. Somewhere between rinsing and hanging the sheets to dry, I began to cry. Quietly at first, then wholly, body shaking, water mingling with tears until I could not tell them apart. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was release. Something that had waited generations for permission. I realized then that everything my grandmother couldn't say had ripened inside me, waiting to burst open through the simplest human act, washing what once held her scent. The wind rose outside, pulling sunlight through the wet sheets. For a brief second, their shifting shadows looked like her hands waving from another world. In that moment, I understood that healing doesn't always arrive with revelation or rituals. Sometimes it arrives disguised as ordinary motion, a small domestic gesture that carries centuries of accumulated ache. Water had become my translator. Each drip from the faucet, each rinse of fabric said what our family never could. Enough restraint. Let it flow. When my mother found me there, my eyes read. She didn't ask questions. She simply sat on the floor beside me. The air between us was still, full, fragile. Finally, she spoke. I never saw her cry. I know, I answered. Maybe we can cry for her now. We both sat, tears mixing with soapy water. A baptism of 2 generations returning softness to a lineage that had lost it. Outside, the cicadas sang their relentless hymn of life moving forward. The house seemed lighter, as if grateful someone had finally heard its quiet weeping. Later that evening, as the sun collapsed into the hills, we wandered to the edge of the property where a small stream cut through the orchard. The light danced on its surface, liquid gold, fleeting, alive. I felt compelled to wade in, shoes and all. The water bit cold against my skin, pulling goosebumps up my legs. I closed my eyes and for the first time didn't resist the impulse to pray. Not the rehearsed petitions of childhood, but a conversation with everything unseen. May this water remember differently, I whispered. May it carry forward not fear, but renewal. May the daughters who come after us know how to rest. My mother joined me, standing knee-deep, silent, eyes glassy. She reached for my hand. Her grip was uncertain but willing. We stayed until the sun disappeared completely, feeling something loosen between our palms. The weight, the inheritance, the unsent letters of sorrow dissolving into the stream. No one told me that forgiveness doesn't start with words. It starts with water. Because water doesn't ask who is guilty. It simply offers to cleanse whatever the living are finally ready to release. That night, lying in the hollowed quiet of the old bedroom, I dreamt of her. Not the stern, reserved grandmother I remembered, but of her younger self. The girl with quiet eyes and trembling hands, walking toward me through moonlit olive trees. She didn't speak. She simply pressed that old silver brooch into my palm. When I looked down, its surface gleamed again, polished, almost new. I woke with my fist closed around nothing but warmth. And yet, for the first time, it was enough. Because no one told me that sometimes healing doesn't give you something back. It gives you back yourself. Autumn arrived quietly, like a lesson repeating itself until I finally paid attention. By then, the house had been sold and my mother and I had returned to the city. But something of the village followed us the way light fell, the new stillness between our words, the gentle ache of unfinished prayers. I hung the washed linens on my small apartment balcony. When the wind blew through them, they billowed softly as if breathing. It became a daily ritual. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring too long, waiting for the fabric to whisper back. Maybe I wasn't washing just cloth anymore. Maybe I was cleansing time itself. Healing had rearranged everything quietly. The fear of stillness that once ruled our lineage was beginning to dissolve. Silence didn't feel dangerous anymore, it felt alive. It hummed now, not heavy but watchful. The sound of something ancient finally exhaling. One morning I was writing in my journal when the wind picked up again. It slammed the balcony door open, and for a heartbeat I thought I heard my grandmother's hum carried on the air. Low, steady, almost a sigh turned into melody. I froze, then I laughed. Because maybe it wasn't her. Maybe it was me, finally remembering the tune without needing her to sing it first. But no one told me that healing feels like you become the very ancestor you were grieving. Until that moment, I'd been chasing closure like a finish line. That morning I understood there is no finish line. There's only transformation. Her pain had not disappeared. It had changed its voice, one that sang through wind, water, breath. I called my mother that evening. "Do you ever miss her differently now?" I asked. She paused. "Yes," she said. "It hurt simpler." That phrase stayed with me, hurt simpler. Grief stripped of its defenses. Pain allowed to exist without armor. That's the closest thing to peace we'd ever known. Later that week we met at a tiny cafe by the river. My mother brought an envelope she said she'd found at the back of her closet. It was tucked inside one of her hymn books, she said, sliding it toward me. Inside was a single folded paper, yellowed but intact. The handwriting unmistakable, Lydia's careful cursive. It wasn't a letter. It was a prayer. It read, "May what I could not say be understood through those I love." That was all. No goodbye, no apology, no confession. Just that one line. But it felt like an answer to a question I didn't know I'd asked. I looked at my mother and she looked at me, both speechless. Because there, in her gentle scrawl, my grandmother had left permission for us to speak, to cry, to live openly. The cafe window rattled as a gust swept by. I took it as confirmation, wind carrying her voice through time one more time. We stepped outside and stood by the railing, river glinting beneath the setting sun. The air smelled faintly of rain and jasmine. People's laughter echoed from the bridge. Life felt unreasonably tender. I reached into my pocket for the silver brooch. The metal was warm now, as if it had learned the temperature of my pulse. Without ceremony, I unclasped it and fastened it to my mother's coat. She blinked in surprise. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I said. "It remembers things for us now." That evening, walking home, every streetlight shimmered slightly, and I suddenly realized the sorrow I'd carried wasn't leaving. It had simply changed its shape from burden into belonging. No one told me that peace isn't the absence of mourning. It's the fluency of it, the ability to hold your past without drowning in it. Weeks passed. The balcony linens stopped fluttering. I finally let them rest. But whenever the wind moved through the city, a faint echo remained. A song that belonged to my grandmother, my mother to me. It carried no lyrics, only the cadence of women finally breathing freely. That was the day I realized the wind had begun to remember us differently. Not as broken, not as ghosts, but as proof that love continues long after silence ends. Months slipped by in gentler rhythms. The brooch stayed pinned to my mother's coat for a while before she tucked it into a keepsake box. Not out of neglect, but completion. Sometimes ending a ritual is what proves it worked. I began to notice small transformations that didn't need fanfare. I could sit in silence now without reaching for distraction. I could feel sadness without immediately wanting to fix it. I could look at my reflection and recognize the soft strength behind my eyes. Not inherited fear, but self-possession. Healing had shifted from event to atmosphere. It wasn't something I did anymore. It was something I lived inside. I started writing again, not about sorrow this time, but about continuity. Words flowed faster, easier. It felt as though the language that had been trapped in my family's bones was finally moving through ink instead. Each paragraph became a gentle act of release. My friends noticed too. "You seem lighter," one said. And it was true. Not lighter as in lesser, but lighter as in carrying differently. No one told me that letting go sometimes looks like remembering without resistance. On Sundays, my mother and I continued our ritual walks by the river. We rarely talked about the past anymore, though its presence walked quietly beside us. Occasionally, she'd pause, glance at the water, and say almost to herself, she'd be proud of us, you know. And I believed her. What amazed me most was how peace arrived stealthily. No dramatic sunrise, no thunderclap epiphany. Just gradual alignment between what my heart knew and what my life now reflected. That subtle steadiness was the reward. I began mentoring younger women in my community. Women who were also learning to balance inheritance and individuality. I recognized their tremor. That uncertainty of how much of your mother's story lives in your skin. Together we practiced what my grandmother never could. Speaking before silence hardened into habit. Some evenings I'd burn lavender and listen as the apartment filled with its clean, sleepy scent. I'd think of all the women before us and feel them exhale through the air vents and curtain folds. Peace is not absence, I realized. It is companionship without demand. That summer my mother mailed me a small package. Inside, the brooch, polished, shining again, attached to a brief note. For your daughter someday, or whoever will need its memory next. I smiled and set it on my writing desk. Not as burden, not as relic. Simply as proof that sorrow once seen can become beauty. But no one told me that peace feels less like a rival and more like an ongoing permission. The permission to love what was, exactly as it was, and still step forward softly. Mornings have grown slower now, by choice, not fatigue. I wake before the city stirs, brew tea, and let the light spill across the table. Silence used to mean danger. Now it feels like conversation. The air hums with presence instead of absence. Sometimes I touch the brooch resting on my desk. Its surface mirrors the dawn, subtle, forgiving. It doesn't carry grief anymore. It carries continuity. People ask if I miss her. I do, but differently. It's not the sharp longing that used to hollow my ribs. It's a soft tether, alive but weightless. She is everywhere, quiet lives, the between of rain beats, the hush before I speak. My mother says she dreams of her more often lately. Not the stoic seamstress she remembered, but a radiant version, spinning in a field of tall grass, laughing. We both believe that joy ripples backward through time if we dare to live it fully now. Maybe that's how the lineage heals itself. One generation choosing laughter without guilt. No one told me that peace can echo too. It doesn't shout. It hums low, steady, patient, the same frequency of a heart finally unguarded. Every so often I return to the river, the same one where the water first taught us to weep differently. I sit and watch the light bend and think, this is what remains when the echo fades, the clarity of water after the silt has settled. Still movement. Quiet truth. Sometimes I bring young women from the writing group there. We practice the art of unburdened storytelling. Each time one of them shares a piece of inherited sorrow aloud, the current seems to sparkle brighter, as if the river itself approves of our small rebellions. What once felt like ancient heaviness now feels like belonging to something vast and merciful. My mother came with me once more last spring. We stood side by side, listening to the wind thread through the reeds. She whispered, "It doesn't haunt me anymore." There was a smile in her words. I nodded and thought, maybe nothing ever haunted us. It was just love waiting for translation. And that simple sentence, both a confession and a benediction, felt like the closing of a circle. The circle my grandmother began with silence. My mother continued with survival, and I am learning to conclude with tenderness. But no one told me that concluding doesn't mean severing. It means caring differently. As I write these final lines, the evening light settles golden across the page. The brooch glows faintly beside me, gleam of generations. The wind passes through the open window, calm, unhurried. I listen. And in that listening I understand. All the unspoken words have already been heard. In the end, what her story gave me was not tragedy, it was translation. I learned that grief is a language you can make gentle again. That silence, once respected but not feared, becomes space for breath to happen. My grandmother once survived by sewing thread through fabric. I survive by threading meaning through memory. Different materials, same devotion. To mend, to connect, to keep something from unraveling too soon. When I think of her now, I no longer see the rigid posture of endurance. I see the young woman humming through pain, the mother holding her watchful child, the quiet elder turning tears into hymns beneath her breath. I see love in its raw form, wordless, persistent, luminous through every generation that tried to carry it. Healing did not erase the wound. It taught me where it lived and how to live alongside it. Peace arrived not as perfection but as permission to keep living, knowing I carry more than sorrow. I carry lineage as light. The brooch sits on my windowsill now, catching sun and shadow alike. When dawn touches it, I imagine her smile rising somewhere beyond sight, no longer waiting, simply watching. No one told me that to heal the past, you don't need to rewrite it. You only need to greet it every morning and say, I see you. Because the truth is simple and sacred. What we inherit does not have to define us. But acknowledging it, loving it tenderly sets every story, living and dead, free to breathe again. And so when the wind visits my window, I bow slightly. Let it move through. It smells faintly of olive trees and summer rain. It sounds like her. It sounds like me. It sounds like peace.